The archetype in Buddhism, in terms of a listening presence, is Kuan Yin, or the Bodhisattva of compassion. And it's said that Kuan Yin listens to the cries of the world, and that listening is so open, receptive, still, respectful, that in that tender receptivity, she's then able to respond with compassion. So, anytime we talk about the archetype of a bodhisattva, we're talking about a capacity that's in each of us, is actually part of the way our brain has evolved. We have the capacity for that quiet listening to really discover what's going on, to understand. And yet, as we know, and there's tons of research on it now, not listening is pervasive. And I just pulled out a few of the little factoids. 85% of what we learn is through listening. It's the essence of good communication. 75% of the time we're distracted, preoccupied, or forgetful. Okay? After listening, we immediately recall about 50%, and then 1 hour later, 20% of what we heard. Pretty bad. The average person listens at only 25% efficiency. And against all the stats, when people are asked to self-assess how good a listener are you, everybody considers himself above average. So an old man is wondering if his wife has a hearing problem or wasn't listening so well. So one night he stood behind her for a while she's sitting in a lounge chair, and he speaks softly to her, "Honey, can you hear me?" No response. He moves a little closer and says again, "Honey, can you hear me?" Again, no response. Finally, he moves right behind her. "Honey, can you hear me?" And she replies, for the third time, "Yes." It's never us, right? Okay. So we don't listen well, okay? We're only using 25% efficiency, and it's getting worse because technology, the medium that we operate in, is down-leveling our listening. There's so many books on it now. One of the ones I read about a year or two ago, Shallows, by Nicholas Carr, was very interesting, describing how we're gaining this capacity to filter massive amounts of information. We can take in a lot of information and process it, but not in a deep and absorbent way. Instead, the more plugged in we are to the internet, in front of the screen, the less capacity to concentrate, the less capacity to make deep associations that are meaningful, to immerse ourselves, the less capacity to slow down. In other words, we need our stimuli to come faster and faster. We don't have the space to listen and take in. Now, the deal is that if you really start looking and sensing for yourself what keeps you from listening, there's the basic understanding that while we have the capacity in our most newly evolved part of our brain, the frontal cortex, when the limbic system is activated and starts dominating, in other words, I want, I have to have, I'm afraid I don't want, I don't like, all of that, when it starts dominating our listening, which basically says, when we're stressed, we can't listen very well, which I know everybody knows, but think about it. We're mostly stressed, so we're not listening. So the more plugged in, the less we take. And there was one little story of a math teacher seeing little Johnny is very distracted, not paying attention in class, not listening. So she calls him and says, "Johnny, what are 4, 2, 28, and 44? And little Johnny quickly replies, "NBC, CBS, HBO, and the Cartoon Network." So next part of this exploration is we're going to look more directly. I'm going to invite you to check and sense for yourself what gets in the way of listening, okay? if we look at our conversations, if we have any agenda, when we're talking to somebody, of wanting them to be a certain way, wanting the conversation to go a certain way, wanting to make an impression, wanting to be approved of, wanting to get their time, money, energy, if there's any agenda to be right, to show how right we are, to show how knowledgeable we are, I think you get the idea here, right? Any agenda like that at all, the lens narrows and we can't take in what's really happening. We can't take in the person. We can't take in the situation. When we have wanting mind, so one of my favorite illustrations is a woman sitting on a park bench and a guy gets off a bus and he sits down. And she says, you know, so how are you doing? What's going on? He goes, oh, I just got out of prison. She goes, oh, what for? He goes, well, I murdered my wife. And she goes, so you're single, you know? I love that one. And I will confess, and this I've never confessed this one before, but I remember very vividly my first conversation with my husband, Jonathan. And I remember in that conversation, in the back of my mind, wondering whether he was married or was in a relationship or whatever. And so I remember the point of the conversation, I said, so do you have family around here? And he didn't, you know, and I mean, and by family I was trying to, but we all do it in very subtle ways or very not subtle ways, and it makes it so we're not there with that receptive presence. Now, sometimes the wanting that pulls us away from listening doesn't have anything to do with the other person. Sometimes I want to get somewhere else and do something different, right? And that stops us from really being in the conversation. So let's pause here. Let's just take a moment and invite you to check in. Just close your eyes. And identify for yourself a recent conversation, ideally today, where you can tell as you scan that the wanting agenda was there. That in some way you were wanting help with something, approval, affirmation, you wanted to be right, you wanted to show off something, you wanted to get something. And just to get familiar so you're more alert, because the whole deal is being alert to how the limbic system interferes. Just rerun the conversation. Just notice for yourself how that wanting agenda in some way narrowed the lens, torqued things so you didn't really listen from a whole place, a whole being place.